I'd like to continue our consideration of faith by going to a very familiar text, I'm sure, to all of us in Hebrews 11:1. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. We have heard tonight of the effect of unbelief on a person and how our acceptance in the sight of God is dependent upon it. But now we're going to look more specifically at the effect faith has upon the believer. Also, as Brother Jonathan has stated this evening, the manner in which our text is written prevents those who take it seriously from philosophizing about the matter, especially considering the amount of revelation that we have received on the subject. It is inexcusable to treat faith as some nebulous, abstract idea. As we look closer at our text, we will see that the Spirit, through Paul, has in quite a salient statement summarized what faith in fact is. We should do well to take heed to these words. Without faith it is impossible to please him, then it is imperative that we know what it is and what it does. Firstly, faith is the substance of things hoped for. Substance, as it is defined in the natural realm, is what makes something real. Similar to the scientific concept of matter, the substance of something is what makes it perceivable. Anything that cannot be touched, tasted, smelt, seen, or heard is perceived as imaginary and not an actual reality. According to man's wisdom, anything that is not perceived by our senses and is not in its nature tangible is in essence abstract. It is in the realm of thought and having no physical reality attached to it. However, the substance that we are speaking of tonight, which is presented by our text, is not substance as is thought of in the physical, simply because God cannot be measured by earthly standards of perception. It cannot be said that the promises of God and the realities of the world to come are tangible. However, it also cannot be said that they are abstract. They are as real, or more appropriately, they are more real than the reality of the world all around us. However invisible they may seem. In truth, the world in which we find ourselves only finds its reality in that God created it. Perception of the unseen realm and understanding of God's eternal purpose and his promises to those who are in Christ, then, actually transcends the reality in which we find ourselves. While we do not deny the very real circumstances in which we find ourselves as we are passing through this world, we realize that this is not all there is to our existence. That eventually this life will pass away, and the things which God has determined to do since before time and substance as we know it was even created will come to pass. When Israel was in the midst of their wilderness wanderings, the Lord constantly affirmed to them that he was the God who led them out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand, with the intent to give them this promised land as an inheritance that they might dwell there. However, no matter the abundance of miracles, the supernatural protection, and the mighty deliverance from the enemy which they experienced, they constantly forgot the reason for why they were taken out of Egypt. They could not have patience with their circumstances and could not trust that the Lord would do all that was required to lead them to the land of promise. In short, they could not see afar off. They really were not persuaded that what God had promised to do would come to pass. All this being said, the main point of this portion of our text is this. Faith causes us to live in view of a future reality. Faith is what makes the promises of God real to us. It enables us to reach out and take hold of the transcendent reality of them. That his word is more sure than anything else. That if he said it, no matter how things may seem in the present, it will indeed come to pass. Yes. Amen. Later in the chapter, speaking of those who by faith overcame the various circumstances in their lives, it is said in Hebrews 11:13, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Here we have a perfect example of how faith works in the individual to allow them to live their life according to the promise of God, and not earthly circumstance. There are four things in this text I want to particularly look at concerning the substance of these things to come, and that is that they saw the promises, they were persuaded of them, they embraced them, and they confessed that they were strangers. Firstly, those who died in faith saw the promises. They had been made aware of what God planned to do. In each case that is presented here in Hebrews 11, God is the one who took the initiative to make his purpose known unto the holy men of old. It is certain that if he had not, they would have never known. The will of God is such that it cannot be sought out and understood unless he himself makes it known. More specifically, they saw them afar off. They did not understand everything about what was to come. In many cases, the actual revelation that they had was not in abundance. In some cases, just a few words from God sporadically over many years. This, however, testifies to the constraining power of faith. Even with such a small amount of information, which according to man's wisdom would have been far from enough to form a conclusion, they were able to understand that God's promise was sure. How much more then, brethren, should we who have been given such an abundance of revelation be able to perceive the things which God has promised to us? If these with so rare a word from God could take hold of them so firmly, what excuse could we possibly have for not doing the same? They saw them afar off, and they were persuaded of them. This persuasion does not merely involve an intellectual understanding, as so many talk about faith today, but it involves the heart as well. Unlike worldly intellectual conclusions, which come as a result of using your senses to consider and weigh a subject, faith bypasses your senses and takes hold of your heart. And they embraced them. Only those who are confident of the surety of these promises will foster a desire to see their fulfillment. It can be said then that to the degree that you are convinced of the reality of the promises of God, you will have your joy in them. And lastly, they confess that they were strangers. Only those who have seen what God has promised, have become completely persuaded of their reality, and have fostered an expectation of their fulfillment, will completely forsake their life here to obtain them. After all, if this life is the totality of our existence, why would we not be focused on getting out of it everything that we possibly could? Why would we deny ourselves? What reason would we have to? Those who it is speaking of in this verse, who died in faith, were able to look beyond these things because of the overwhelming confidence they had that there was a greater reward waiting for them than anything that the temporal pleasures of this world could afford. They confessed that they were strangers. This is not merely speaking of a verbal confession, but it is a summary of their lives. And the things in which they did, the decisions that they made, and the things that they sacrificed to obtain the promise, testify that they did not consider themselves to be citizens of the here and now.